Ali, you're very welcome to the show. How are you?
Oh, good. Thanks for having me, John. It's great to chat about this.
Okay, so we're going to get into detail, particularly about the American kind of gun running side of it. Give us, like, if you could, like, a brief synopsis on what the book is about, like the elevator pitch, if you will.
Yeah, elevator pitches when it comes to books about the Troubles is so hard. So I'm gonna give it my best shot here. But the book is about a small group of Irish Americans that kind of sent the Provisional IRA its first real haul of high capacity weapons in the early 1970s. Taken writ large, it's sort of looking at how Irish America, and in particular this group called the Irish Northern Aid Committee, which is sort of common in the Irish American lexicon, was involved in the early 70s and in sending a lot of support, money, guns over to the IRA to kind of kick off the Troubles.
Very interesting. Okay, so I was thinking we would start this chronologically. There's a group that's very much at the center of the book called Clan Na Gael. Funny enough, not only do they predate the provisional IRA, but they actually predate the original IRA, the War of Independence one. Could you give us a little history on them?
Yeah, Clan Na Gael is so important when we're talking about Irish America and Irish American gun running, but it's really not talked about as much as the Irish Northern Aid Committee. NORAID as this acronym sort of kind of sucks the air out of the room. Like that's kind of who people think of when they think of Irish America and the Troubles and Irish America and gun running. But the truth of it is, like, Clan Na Gael was actually the much more hardline organization that was kind of nested within NORAID or filtered throughout NORAID. And the long and short of it is really, Clan Na Gael grows out of the Fenian movement in the late 1800s. And it becomes this kind of repository for veterans of the IRA. As you said, it predates the IRA. It kind of grows out of this Fenian movement, the IRB, like sort of before the nationalist Republican movement had kind of coalesced around the Irish Republican Army. But the Clan Na Gael kind of becomes the American outpost for Irish Republicans on the run, and that predates the War of Independence. I mean, that's beginning, as I said, in the Fenian movement, late 1800s, into the War of Independence, and Clan Na Gael kind of it centers itself in these sort of prototypical Irish American cities. You have Boston, you have New York, you have Philadelphia, and it becomes this story, especially when we're looking at the 1920s. And you have partition, you have the Civil War, you have anti-treaty IRA veterans who suddenly need to get away from the island pretty quickly. Clan Na Gael already has this structure in America, and it becomes this place that kind of cultivates this community of really hardline IRA guys after the War of Independence, after partition. And so it becomes this repository for hardline Republican sentiment in America. And it just sort of fosters that from the 1920s onward in a really concentrated way.
Interesting. Yeah, worth mentioning they provided, like, I think they were like the single biggest funder of the 1916 Rising. I didn't know this before reading. Also worth mentioning the FBI had a file on them as far back as the 50s even. So like before the Troubles even began. Yeah, just
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, super well known. It's something, that's kind of common with any of these kind of Irish Republican organizations in the States. As you said, they were quite open. Like the FBI knew who they were, as early as the 1950s, possibly even earlier, and kind of knew that they were a place where some of this radical sentiment was being fostered, knew that they were probably involved in guns. It was kind of an open secret. And a lot of members of Clan Na Gael, would go on the radio or speak openly at rallies about the importance of supporting the IRA and a reunited Ireland. So it was very openly in that camp. And as you said, they had these kind of very open affiliations with armed campaigns in both the North and the Republic. They were connected to a lot of different arms dumps, and they were connected to a lot of different funding streams. And, I think we mentioned in the book, like they had these sort of, some of these schemes sounded kind of harebrained and others actually came to fruition. So they just sort of like threw everything they could at this from the States, and then became a place where if you were on the run, if you needed to get out of the island quickly and you needed to kind of settle among like kind, people knew that Clan Na Gael was there in the States as a soft place to land.
very good. Okay, so obviously when we think of like Irish America and Irish American diaspora, Boston is probably the first one. In terms of percentage, it's probably a much higher percentage of Irish Americans than New York. Obviously, New York is much bigger and has more. So yeah, there's these two would be like the at the forefront. Tell us why Philly in particular is so linked to the North. It was very interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know this before I really started book research. There's also kind of this historic chip on Philadelphia's shoulder towards pretty much any other city, but especially cities on the East Coast like New York and Boston. There's a long rivalry between Philly and Boston that involves sports and otherwise. So I was kind of going into this already on my own of like, well, how can I, Philly never gets its due as an Irish American city. And like, why the hell does Boston get all this credit here? But something that was really interesting to me as an Irish American, kind of looking at my own history and why people landed where they did. All of these cities you mentioned are known as kind of Irish American cities, but just because of the nature of chain migration, the way that the Irish diaspora sort of spread out in the States, these cities aren't just known as, Irish American cities. They're cities with diasporas from very specific counties, and like, a lot of people from Belfast go to Boston. A lot of people from the West go to Boston. There's kind of an adage on the West Coast of Ireland that the next parish over is Boston, when you talk about New York, you have a bit more of kind of a broad-based diaspora and just based on where people came from, who followed who. And Philadelphia, their diaspora was very specifically Northern, which I had not realized. And to the point that when you tell people around the North that you're from Philadelphia, one of the first things they say is like, oh, that's a Tyrone town, or oh, it's an Armagh town. And a lot of this is because of old shipping routes that took a lot of people from Derry into Philadelphia. It was just kind of how people went, and decades, generations later, when people needed to leave again, they followed where their friends, cousins, uncles, aunts went. So Philadelphia winds up kind of collecting this group of not just like a really concentrated Irish diaspora, but it very specifically collects a diaspora from the six counties. And I think that was what made Philadelphia so interesting to me as a story. Not only was I so personally interested in like elevating Philly in this lexicon of Irish Americanness, but it kind of has its own special story there, and it's got such a unique diaspora within it, and it's fostered that for generations now.
There's many characters, we'd say character, real people in the book, all described really well. Such interesting backstories. You might take us into, I suppose, kind of, if you had to pick a main guy in the book, probably Vince Conlon. If you could tell us about him, he had, he was literally an IRA veteran before the Troubles even began.
Yeah, and like you said, there's so many people in the book, but they are such characters. Some of these guys are like straight out of central casting. It's like you couldn't write them better if you wanted to. So Vince Conlon was kind of the character that was best to base the book around, because he follows this arc of the entire conflict. And as you said, it predates it. And his story is really reflective of what a lot of Irish Americans' stories were at that time, particularly some of these young men who came to America in the 1950s and 1960s. Vince Conlon was born in the North. He grew up under partition in the six counties. He's from Armagh. And he winds up joining the IRA as an 18-year-old after having spent some time in London and sort of growing up and understanding what partition means, what it means to be Irish in a gerrymandered, occupied place. So he joins the IRA at 18 and he gets involved in the border campaign. And, the border campaign is a really sort of overlooked chapter in the IRA's history and in the history of the conflict. But when we're talking about Irish America and when we're talking about why Irish America was so quick to get involved in the Troubles, it's really important to understand that a lot of people who drove that effort into the 1970s in Irish America were like Vince Conlon and had come to America after the border campaign, which is this very kind of brief, failed effort to again, fight along the border and free the six counties. So Vince Conlon gets involved in the IRA in the 1950s and then eventually has to go on the run, like many men his age in the IRA, and flees to America in the 1960s. And when he gets to the States, he gets involved in Clan Na Gael, and he'd gotten to know Clan Na Gael in his earlier trips over to the States. As I said, it was kind of this ubiquitous, well-known organization if you were an IRA guy on the island. And so he gets involved in Clan Na Gael in the 1960s, and it becomes this kind of critical nexus, both in Irish America and in the North, as they start getting involved in some more interesting transatlantic operations, you know?
Very good. Okay, yeah. I'm obviously there's the book will go into the case of the so-called Philly Five, of which Vince Conlon is one of them. Also, the Dally Canlan, Dan Duffy, Neil Byrne, and a fifth guy, Thomas Regan. Okay, so you might think, okay, you've done plenty of research into Clan Na Gael, into NORAID, into its members, into various things they've been tried for. Can you talk to me about like the overlap between the two?
Yeah, that was what was so kind of brilliant, really, about how this entire effort gets structured in the 1970s. So when we're inching into 1969, 1970, and we're starting to see Belfast kind of light up, Derry is lighting up, the civil rights movement that's sort of gaining a foothold in Northern Ireland is slowly looking like it's going to escalate into an armed conflict. You know, that's happening parallel with Irish America saying like, hey, we need to get some kind of effort together. We need to get involved. So as you're starting to have that dialogue within Irish America, there's kind of two organizations that evolve, you know. So you have Clan Na Gael already, that's been this really you know, radical, ardent, very committed group of people who've kind of been running guns into and out of the North and have been fugitive smuggling in and out of the North for years now. But separately, there's this understanding that like the broader Irish American community, not necessarily just these hardline Clan Na Gael IRA guys, the broader diaspora is really engaged in this and really interested and wants to be involved. And so how do you appeal to that group? And that's where this idea kind of comes to start this group called the Irish Northern Aid Committee. And it's kind of widely billed as a charity organization built to aid, you know, displaced Catholic families in the north of Ireland. You know, it does this through a whole variety of charitable means, donations, dinners, all these kinds of things. So this group called NORAID begins in 1970. And it kind of catches on like wildfire, you know, across the Irish American community. And it becomes this sort of fundraising centerpiece for anyone who wants to feel like they're involved or contributing or helping, you know, Irish Catholic families in the North, you know, particularly second and third generation Irish Americans who want to stay engaged. But the important thing to understand about NORAID is there were a lot of people involved in the formation of NORAID who were also involved in Clan Na Gael and kind of understood the utility and the power of a group like NORAID. So you have this kind of outer shell of NORAID that appeals to tens of thousands of Irish Americans across the country and is kind of raking in cash and donations from these people. And then separately, you have some really key people within NORAID up in kind of the upper echelons, this so-called inner circle, they call it, that is full of Clan Na Gael guys who can kind of, you know, who don't necessarily use the organization to smuggle guns or smuggle people or help fugitives out, but they do know how to kind of skim some of this money off the top or move some things around or use it as a kind of shield for other things they want to do. So these are not, they're not the same group. Clan Na Gael and NORAID are not the same thing, but Clan Na Gael kind of figures out very quickly how they can use a group like NORAID to further their means and do a little bit more than just send money and clothing to displaced families in the North.
I was going to say, NORAID have obviously always strenuously denied that they supply money to the IRA or other Republican paramilitaries, or indeed they've also denied that they've been involved with supplying weapons and so on. These claims are like, I think they're pretty tough to refute, especially given so many members have been caught up in gun running trials. Literally the early checks from NORAID to the north. We're going to Joe Cahill, who, for anyone who doesn't know, was the chief of staff, the highest ranking member of the original Provos. So yeah, in your opinion, were NORAID involved in gun running, and to what extent?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I've kind of come to answer this question is that NORAID as an organization was not involved in gun running or large scale gun running, fugitive smuggling, anything like that. But a lot of NORAID members, or very specific NORAID members, were, and I think that's part of what's it kind of aids in this plausible deniability thing, right? Because as an organization, NORAID kind of always was very nebulous, had kind of confusing record keeping. Nothing was particularly centralized. And there was a real benefit to that because there was, there were a million people who knew a million different things, and the right hand didn't always know what the left was doing. And as a cohesive organization, yeah, like I don't think there was some giant grand conspiracy across 10,000 people to secretly send a lot of guns into Northern Ireland. But at the same time, as you said, the evidence kind of stands for itself that like these were not just one-off instances. There were a good handful of people who worked in a pretty organized way, who were involved in NORAID, who did send guns over, and how or where that buck stopped on which NORAID desk, we probably will never know, but there's certain facts there that you can't deny.
Sure, absolutely. Okay, let's talk about the kind of the juicy bit, how they actually got guns over. Yeah, there was a few different kind of routes, and the main one in the book described was from the Montgomery Loan Company. Spoiler alert: the reason, other than the surveillance and stuff, the reason how we know so much about it and what you were able to draw from the book is because one of the guys who got involved, by the name of John Casey, ratted. It wouldn't be an IRA troubles related story without a tout. So yeah, if sorry, long question, but if you could you take us into the actual process of getting guns from America to the north like they did?
The logistics of their actual gun running operation are kind of brilliant in how rudimentary they are, and I think that's what makes their gun trafficking operation so fascinating, is that we're not talking like high level underground arms dealers, running some crazy sophisticated gun running network. This is literally a bunch of soccer dads and carpenters. Like if you went up to any basic guy on the street and gave him an Armalite and said, how do you think we should get this over to Belfast? Like this is probably what they think of, it's just totally catch as catch can. So, they got guns however they could. Part of this really critical part of this story is that we're talking about America. It's a lot easier to get guns here, So you had them kind of buying a lot of guns. Sometimes it was under their real names. Sometimes it was through fake IDs. However they came to them, they kind of collect this big pile of guns. And then it's really just this sort of rudimentary relay system, getting these guns from basements in Philadelphia, bar rooms in Philadelphia, and getting it up to New York. So after the guns are kind of collected in Philly, they slowly ferry these guns up to New York, and they do this in kind of really incredible ways. Like one of the guys welds a false bottom onto his construction van and hides a bunch of the guns in there and drives it up and down the New Jersey Turnpike. There's one instance in which they take one of these vans full of guns and kind of park it at a rest stop in New Jersey and then leave in a different car, and the car is picked up by somebody else, and then it shows up and it's empty. So there's this relay system transferring all these guns slowly up to New York. And what's important about that is that in New York, you had a real connection among the NORAID Clan Na Gael group with the unions, including the longshoremen's unions, a lot of connections on the docks. And so once these guns got up into New York, there was a connection between Clan Na Gael and the plumbers union. And there was a warehouse specifically in I believe it was the Bronx, where they hid a lot of these guns. And they kind of kept them in this plumbing warehouse until they could slowly package them up, either hiding them in sofas or putting them in other boxes and labeling them as plumbing supplies or whatever, and then kind of slowly sneaking them onto the New York City docks and sending them over to either Dublin or Northern Ireland. And we know from other reporting in the north at the time that once these shipments would wind up on the island, whether that's through Dublin, whether that's through Cove, whether that's through Belfast, whatever, usually they'd come in through Dublin, and then the guns would be kind of carefully ferried up to Newry near the border, hidden in trees and plants or whatever, and then someone from the other side would come pick it up. So it's just this really incredible relay system that takes it from like a suburban Philadelphia gun dealer all the way through all these hands into like a bush outside Newry, and then next thing you know, it's getting picked up and brought into West Belfast.
I meant to say this earlier. Obviously there was a two-part, quite well-made documentary that came out recently on RT about NORAID. There was a court case in that which ended in some weird plot twist about like the government weren't able to convict because the guys on trial, their lawyer basically turned the tables on the prosecutor and said that you have to prove that this particular guy they were buying from wasn't from the CIA. That was in I believe the early mid 80s. We're not talking about this. No confusion here. The case we're talking about is early 70s, and then when it went to trial, I think it was like 75, 76. So yeah, no, just so people are
correct. Like it's really important. I was actually talking to the director of that documentary about this recently. These chapters of NORAID and these chapters of NORAID gun trafficking, like they're very separate. You know, the NORAID that we're talking about in like 1969 to 1975, completely different ball game than the one we're talking about in the 1980s and the Whitey Bulgers and the CIA Michael Flannery gun trafficking case. You know, some of these characters are still around, but it's a very different organization, completely different gun trafficking case, and really just a totally different landscape.
And probably the aspect of this book that fascinated me most was the clash between these kind of big, scary American Justice Department groups like the FBI, the ATF, I guess normal police, and their efforts against these Irish American gun runners. Yeah, you might take us into that, how their investigation into them began, the type of resources they threw at it.
Yeah, I mean at its heart, this is a story about a really kind of crazy gun running cell and a very cat and mouse gun traffickers, cops situation, right? Good guys versus bad guys. Who's good or bad is going to be very different depending on your perspective. But still, it's this constant like back and forth, cat and mouse. Who's going to win? Who's going to catch who? But there's way bigger questions and bigger themes here to me around this issue of like how law enforcement gets involved. So we're looking at how law enforcement has dealt with Irish republicanism, like leading up to the Troubles, leading up to the 70s. You know, there's kind of this willful ignorance of what's happening there. You know, they know Clan Na Gael exists. They know that they kind of foster this radical Irish Republican sentiment, and they kind of keep this very lazy watch on them. You know, we're talking about the FBI really, and the CIA to some extent, but mostly the FBI kind of knows they're there. They watch them occasionally, but for the most part, they really don't care. Like Northern Ireland is not their problem. They don't want to make it their problem. They need to check the box. Fine. There's also an important thing to understand here, which is that a lot of Irish Americans at this time are in law enforcement, you know, so there's not necessarily a cohesive political position on Northern Ireland from the US government, from law enforcement, whatever. So it's kind of like, okay, we're going to watch these guys, but we don't want anyone to have to actually make a call on whether they're right or wrong or legal or illegal. Like we prefer to just not make it an issue. That's how this kind of proceeds for decades, really. You know, there's this understanding between the FBI and Clan Na Gael that like, look, we're watching you, don't do anything crazy, you know, whatever. That all changes so quickly once the Troubles kicks off, you know? Because when we're talking about the years before, it's like even guns that were going over from America, you don't really have this crisis level issue in the North, at least not from the American perspective. You know, the British government is not knocking on their door and saying, figure this out for us. That changes so quickly once these Clan Na Gael and NORAID guys start getting serious weapons into Northern Ireland, right? Because we were seeing the Troubles kick off. We're seeing that this isn't going to be one of these one-off clashes in Northern Ireland. This is going to be very likely what's a sustained, brutal war. And more problematically for the British and then inherently the Americans is that these guys are fighting with American guns. And that becomes very obvious very quickly to British investigators, the RUC up in the north, as they start recovering some of these guns, as they start to, as the Provos start to really gain ground in Belfast, they're realizing that like, these are not the old Thompson rifles that these guys were fighting with 10 years ago. Oh my God, these are American Armalites. Where the hell are they coming from? So that whole balancing act that American law enforcement had been content to have for a long time changes very quickly, because the Brits finally do come and knock on their door and say, hey, look, we can't feign ignorance on this anymore. You need to clean up your backyard and take care of this. So even, beginning almost immediately, really, you get a lot of federal law enforcement officers basically flooding the zone of these NORAID meetings, and that becomes a real Achilles heel for NORAID, because as they're trying to appeal to these broader Irish American sentiments, they're also quite open. Anyone can come to a NORAID charity, anyone can come to a NORAID meeting, which means it's a really easy place for a lot of undercover FBI guys, many of whom are Irish, to sit around, get to know a lot of people, have the chats, and figure out what they're dealing with. So, we start to see in like 1971, 1972, NORAID becomes riddled with FBI informants and undercover FBI guys, right? And there's this really kind of there's these really like cinematic almost scenes and the detailed in a lot of these court documents of like undercover FBI guys sitting at Irish bars, and the Clan Na Gael guys talk about all these guys start coming into their pubs in like suits, and they're like, okay, well, obviously you're not just here for the charity dance. So there's this kind of constant surveillance going on very quick with these guys, and they're operating under a microscope, really. There's FBI guys parked outside their houses. They're following them to church. They're following down the turnpike. They're keeping an eye on everything they do. They're driving up and down from New York with them. And, it just becomes this really untenable situation very quickly for the FBI. And later the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, who just very quickly need to get a handle on Irish America and throw everything and the kitchen sink at it.
I was going to say, what mentioning throughout this investigation, at one stage, NORAID / Clan Na Gael members were doing business with. They didn't know it, but an undercover ATF agent, Bill Kelly, not his real name. He was trying to sell them rocket launchers. They were also dealing with, at one stage, a guy who was not an agent but an informant for the ATF, John Nigro. You might tell us about these two and their impact on the case.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of speaks to just how desperate these NORAID and Clan Na Gael guys were to get their hands on guns, because when you look back at, as you mentioned, this guy named Bill Kelly or this guy named John Nigro, like they quite obviously are not reliable. If you're trying to do a secret gun deal, like they're probably not the guys you should have been talking to. Like they didn't seem like the most discreet characters. But Bill Kelly, kind of shows up out of nowhere for these guys and just so happens to offer the exact rocket launchers that they mysteriously need. And they're so eager to get their hands on these things that they wind up having this kind of extended dialogue with him, and they make arrangements for pickups, and they make arrangements for, where they're going to store the guns and how they're going to pay him and everything. And, this happens more than once in these situations where they get so far into these dealings and they kind of tell the guy everything. They say, look, we're involved in NORAID, but we're taking the NORAID money and buying guns. And then mysteriously, when they go to actually buy the weapons, the guys they're supposed to buy from disappear. So Bill Kelly kind of vanishes into the night after he's told everything and given some money. And then they never really know what happens to him until, of course, it all kind of comes to bear in a courtroom. John Nigro is another guy kind of in that space, although he's less, as you said, he's not an undercover FBI agent, but he's sort of a career hustler. And again, we have another instance of one of these Irish Americans who's involved in NORAID, involved in Clan Na Gael, who's so eager to make a score, to find a guy who can get them what they need. that he winds up, striking off in this long explanatory conversation with this guy who he knows kind of has connections to gun running, might have connections to the mob, all these different things. And basically like makes arrangements to get guns from him. And the first call that your man makes when they hang up the phone is to the ATF. Kind of hustling the hustlers and saying, hey, I've got a bunch of guys who want to buy guns for the IRA. Like, I'll be an informant for you. How much will you give me? So they just get to this kind of desperate place where they're relying on a lot of unreliable people, and it really does come to bite them in the end.
Interesting. Okay, talk to us about I suppose the kind of the first crack that appeared in the scheme. I guess we'll say kind of the beginning and the end. I think I'm correct in saying it actually started in my own home county on in Cove. It was like five suitcases with rifles that didn't have the serial numbers scratched off. Yeah, am I correct in saying that was like the kind of the beginning of it for them?
Yeah, it was. I mean, that case, we're talking about a case known as the Fort Worth Five, where a large, I think it's five, as you said, five suitcases that were packed full of American guns are pulled off a boat in Cove. And it's kind of one of the first real scores for investigators on the island. Obviously we're talking about the South, but they're still also keeping an eye on the gun running stuff. It's one of their first huge pieces of evidence that like actually these guns are coming direct from America, because there are five suitcases full of guns that are registered to New York addresses that somehow landed right off the boat into Cork. So that Fort Worth Five case becomes kind of, it's the first real score for American investigators in this case against NORAID, because not only were those five suitcases registered to Irish Americans, they were registered to Irish Americans who were also involved in NORAID. So the Fort Worth Five case, it becomes kind of a colloquialism when we're talking about NORAID. The case itself winds up kind of falling apart, but it's an important moment in this because it makes very clear publicly that American investigators are looking into NORAID and they're looking into gun running. There's been sort of these rumors for a couple of years that, there's weird guys hanging around, they're surveilling us. But when this case sort of explodes into the public and the FBI arrests some of these guys and they start investigating the gun running, it becomes very obvious to everyone else involved that like, oh God, they're actually focusing on this. Is this going to sort of close in on all of us? So the Fort Worth Five case happens. And not long after, we just start to see other NORAID cases start to happen, or people involved with NORAID being charged with gun running. Grand jury summons start coming around in New York, in Baltimore, eventually in Philadelphia. And so it becomes this sort of slow rolling crisis until all of these random kind of circles of gun traffickers wind up sort of getting called on the carpet.
Okay, so yeah, like I mentioned, one of the reasons why we actually know so much is because there was a guy named John Casey who turned informant. He as described in the book, you described him as kind of somewhat of a like a kind of a reluctant gun runner in a sense. He was kind of like almost kind of dragged into it. Could you tell us about the guy who would eventually become the tout in the story?
Yeah, I mean, John Casey is he's sort of like, when you're talking about the broader gun trafficking operation that's happening, you have these hardline guys like you mentioned, Vince Conlon, and a couple other people who work with him. And then there's also a kind of level right below those guys of people who are sort of recruited and brought into the fold, but might not have been as inclined to be so radical or so involved if they hadn't sort of slid into it. John Casey's a really good example of that. He is an Irish American who's engaged with his heritage. He pays attention to the north of Ireland. He also works with the Plumbers Union, which is where a lot of these NORAID and Clan Na Gael guys were connected in particularly in New York. So he's sort of rotating around a lot of these guys, and it becomes sort of a way for these hardliners to vet other people that they might be able to bring into the fold. So John Casey gets kind of invited to a bar one night and kind of cased for like, would he be interested in getting more involved, and can he be trusted? And he's sort of sent on some of these test missions because they do need more hands, right? They need more bodies. They've got a lot of guns they have to pick up. They've got a lot of guns they have to move, and they need more people to help them do it. So John Casey kind of gets recruited to go help buy a few guns illegally with the IDs of like dead Irishmen or fake names. And he kind of, once he passes through that gauntlet, and once both the Clan Na Gael guys see that he's capable of kind of doing this stuff, and now he's also screwed because he bought a gun illegally and he has now tied himself to these guys. He just sort of goes full bore into it, and he gets involved, as many of these guys did, with like running guns up and down the turnpikes and, taking guns back and forth to the docks and doing gun drops and pickups and all these different things. So he's very much part of this, a cog in this broader NORAID Clan Na Gael machine. But the problem with recruiting guys like this, is that you can never be totally sure that they're really willing to go to prison for it, like when you're dealing with true believers in this stuff, a lot of these guys, as you said, there's an irony that any story about the Troubles usually involves an informer. At the same time, there are few organizations that are less tolerant of loose talk than the IRA or Irish Republicanism. So a lot of these hardline guys in Clan Na Gael would be completely fine sitting in prison. And, it becomes this sort of rite of passage really for them to keep their mouth shut and to be, sit in a prison cell and be held in contempt of court. But someone like John Casey, who was sort of pulled into this reluctantly, might not have that same standard. And you see very quickly, as some of these court cases start popping off, as you start to face real prison time and the prospect of a federal investigation, there's a lot of people like John Casey who might be willing to cut a deal to make sure that they don't wind up there. And that's what we ultimately see happening. He becomes this kind of a real cipher for federal investigators, because not only is he tied into the New York group, but he knows what's happening in Philadelphia and Chicago and all these other places. So he very much becomes this sort of key to unlocking a lot of these NORAID cases. And we see him testify in a lot of them. So it was a real coup to get someone like that, and for federal investigators to be able to pull someone like that in the course of the investigation.
For sure, for sure. Okay, so the main case, obviously in the book, is the one of the Philadelphia Five, Calnan, Duffy, Byrne, Conlon, and Regan. There's also a kind of, I guess you would say, like a case in the wider investigation involving a fella called Frank Grady and Marty Lyons that feature heavily in the book. They would later go on to try to appeal what they got convicted for, but didn't weren't successful. Yeah, could you tell us about the actual trial of the Philly Five and how it ended up?
Yeah, the Philadelphia Five trial, it becomes this shorthand really for like, as these cells start to get charged into court. There is this group of these five guys in Philadelphia who wind up being charged with trafficking almost 400 American guns and thousands and thousands of rounds of ammunition into the North. And as you said, it's five guys. So the shorthand for it in NORAID circles becomes like the Philly Five, the Philadelphia Five. And the case, it ends, it starts off where it's taken a couple years for federal investigators to actually get their arms around this stuff, right? Like they start investigating this, they get the Fort Worth Five case in like 1972 or so. And it takes a good 3.5 years really, for them to bring a case against the Philadelphia Five. As tends to happen with fugitives, like two of them have already bounced back to the island. So by the time they charge everybody, Vince Conlon is already back in the North. And so is one of his co-defendants, Tom Regan. So they charge all five of these guys. Only three of them get dragged into court. And, the trial itself, if we're just talking court logistics, it's a 3-week long trial. Two of the guys do get convicted of basically exporting the weapons illegally. It's sort of a strange, they were never actually convicted of gun trafficking. There was there's a lot of legalese and weird hoops that were jumped through here. But two of these guys, Dan Cahalan and Neil Byrne, were convicted of exporting firearms without a proper license from the State Department, basically. They wound up getting a year each in prison. And then get out, and I think probably went right back to what they were doing before they went into prison. But the trial becomes really interesting because not only does this involve American law enforcement right? We're talking about much bigger political forces here, because the truth is, I'm not convinced that any of these cases would have happened if the British government hadn't been seriously pressuring American investigators to convict these guys and to get them, basically stop them sending guns into Northern Ireland. So the Philadelphia case actually winds up involving investigators from the RUC and from the British Army. And there's this whole kind of very fragile diplomatic rigmarole in trying to bring these British and Northern Irish investigators into Philadelphia courtrooms. And, some of these big melodramatics of, they can't be named and they have to be in disguises and they're worried they're going to be attacked by the Irish diaspora in Philadelphia. And how can some of this evidence be used? And, it's interesting reading back some of these transcripts and then also reading some of the communication that was happening between American law enforcement and British law enforcement at the time, which still exists in the British archives, because there's a real understanding of like the propaganda of this case, and the public presentation. Like one of the big things is, the British investigators, they really want piles of guns in an American courtroom, right? Like there's a big visual to that of like, look at this havoc that these men have wrought. And there's some of these really incredible scenes where like wheelbarrows of American Armalites are like brought into this courtroom, and there's just these, there's just a real savvy, really, and British investigators kind of tirelessly trying to explain to American investigators the talking points and how they have to frame some of this and the words they can't say and the words they can say. And it's almost like a very early lesson in like the political propaganda that would kind of come to define, the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And you see it play out in these very kind of funny dialogues between some exhausted RUC investigator who just cannot deal with how stupid these American colleagues are, and these American prosecutors who are very like inflated American ego about it. And there's this there's this constant overarching question of like, America does not want Northern Ireland to be its problem. It does not want to be involved. It does not want to have to piss off its Irish diaspora, and it does not want to have to piss off its British allies. And now it's stuck in the middle of these two things, and it very much does not want to be there. So these broader political forces that play out in the trial are they're fascinating, and we carry a lot of that through the book.
It was like you alluded to, very important point. The US, the prosecutors failed in probably their wider goal, which was to connect this actually to the IRA. That would have been a much that would have been like a home run, as opposed to what they got, which was like essentially kind of like filling out forms wrong. And like you said, they got a year. Like, geez, that's nothing. Like,
yeah, completely. And like you said, it's like those kinds of verdicts are what has allowed this ambiguity to persist about NORAID, of like, that they weren't involved in gun trafficking. Yeah, because these guys weren't actually convicted of gun trafficking. They're technically right. That was never a charge that they caught. And there's actually a real anger from British investigators that they never got that conviction. They never got that stated in court, because kind of their broader goal with the Philadelphia case, which was the largest by far at the time. Like that's what's so critical about this Philadelphia case, is that it was the largest amount of guns by a long stretch that was going from America into the North at that time. The British really wanted that moment of like NORAID men convicted of sending 400 rifles to the North. And the truth is that didn't happen. That conviction didn't happen. And they were not very happy that they lost it.
Okay, so just to kind of wrap up the actual five guys you mentioned, Conlon and Regan never stepped foot in Cork because they got out of the country. Callan and Byrne did get a year. Literally, it's funny. Like they literally didn't even get a year. Sorry, they didn't even get a day for every gun. It's funny. Like
No, you're totally right.
days and guns. Like, okay, so one name remaining in that five was Dan Duffy. My understanding is his kind of carefulness was what actually kind of saved him in the end.
Yeah, I mean, Dan Duffy was really careful about not putting his real name down for guns. And we heard a lot of reporting across the course of the book that there were some of these kind of smaller interpersonal disputes because Duffy really felt like Vince Conlon and some of these other guys were quite careless in how they openly wrote their names and openly signed their names, used their real IDs. And Duffy was much more cautious about that. Some of it was down to principle. Like, I think some of these guys signed their own names because they truly, as we said, they're very open about this stuff. They didn't feel like they were doing anything wrong, right side of history, all of these things. But I think Dan Duffy had a bit more cop on of what could be coming for them legally, and in the end, he had a lot of room for plausible deniability, and it's why he was able to walk away from there a free man.
One mad, well, because maybe not a plot twist, but just something that came up in the book was that Dan Duffy, previous to his like proper getting involved with NORAID and gun running, was that he actually for a time, I think for about 2 years, was like a low level FBI informant, what they might call in the north like a 10-pound tout.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of. Although I don't know. That's an interesting part of the story because it's hard. People think that FBI informants, and this applies back then and it still applies today. People think like the game of FBI informants is very clear cut. Like you either are or you aren't. And you shake the hand, you sign the contract, you get paid for your information, like great. The truth of it is that it tends to be a lot messier than that. And there are a lot of people who the FBI may consider informants that may not even know they were informants. So the thing with Dan Duffy is that, the FBI had him listed as one of its informants. Knowing what I know about Dan Duffy, I kind of doubt he ever thought of himself as an informant. I think he probably had a lot of chats to a lot of people about how he felt about Northern Ireland. I think he was a bit of a blowhard, and a lot of people who knew him said that. And one man's blowhard is another man's informant. So I think it's all kind of it's in the eye of the beholder on that one. But it is kind of a weird rabbit hole that spins off of this thing.
You mentioned the book as well. It's kind of important to mention there's no evidence at all that he cooperated in any way or provided evidence for this particular trial.
No, there's no evidence that he turned on any of his friends. There's no evidence that he ever provided anything of value to the FBI in general. But specifically with this case, yeah, there's no evidence that he was an informant in regards to this case.
Interesting, very good. Reading the book, I say this about a lot of books of the authors that I interview, but this one really would make an excellent like Saying Nothing. Like I think it was 8 parts or 9 parts. It would really make an excellent TV show. There's a lot that obviously in the book we haven't talked about it, but I guess the way you wrote the book was providing what's going on in the north and then America north. It jumped back and forth, done really well. They kind of they kind of sync together and weave together very well. So yeah, almost every chapter I was reading, I was like, God, this would be so cool on TV, like the ATF and the FBI and all the rats. Would that be something that you'd like to see happen?
Yeah, I mean, it does. It feels so cinematic in a lot of ways, and like I think the thing that I like, one of the reasons I would, love if that happened is that it is such an important slice of history. It's full of such crazy characters, that it'd be cool if there was a way for it to reach a broader audience like that. It's like, because it isn't just a story about the Troubles. It isn't just a story about Irish America. It's actually like, especially at this moment, at this day and age, it's a story about like immigrant identity and like how we relate to home and how we manage our responsibilities to home and the place we're from. So all these really heady questions I think come to bear in the story, and it's who doesn't like a good cat and mouse gun running game.
Yeah, maybe to wrap it up, I guess kind of the main character, if you will, Vince Conlon. How did he end up?
I mean, Vince Conlon is the character that carries the whole book through, right? He's actually, not to give it away, he's really one of the only ones that kind of makes it from beginning to end, because this is such a long sustained conflict that people die, you lose people, you lose stories, you lose memories. And Vince Conlon's arc to me is the most important and also kind of the most redemptive in a lot of ways, because he goes from being one of these central characters fueling the Troubles to then being one of kind of the forefront Irish Americans helping to navigate the peace process and kind of helping in this really critical moment when Gerry Adams comes over to the States. And, it's Vince Conlon who kind of helps manage moving this really radical, very fractured Irish American base, all kind of oriented now toward Sinn Féin, toward peace, toward the Good Friday Agreement. So, Vince winds up getting close to seeing, the full scope of this. And there's kind of some really, the part that I love about Vince Conlon's story is that it's through him that I think you're able to understand just how intimate that this conflict is, and how much it touches everybody on this island, even years later, and how Vince Conlon winds up in spaces 20 years after the 70s where he's rubbing elbows or in the same conversations with people who used some of the guns that he sent 20 years ago, and they don't even know, right? It's like, it's so, I think as an American, even as an Irish American, a couple generations removed, it's so easy for us to ignore how small this is and what having such an intense conflict in such a small place for so long actually does to a group of people. And I think Vince Conlon kind of brings that home because he really does straddle both sides of the ocean here. And through his story, I think we see how this huge country, this huge effort, these tens of thousands of Irish Americans in NORAID actually wind up, influencing a really concentrated community in a small place. And so I have a lot of, I care a lot about his story, and I'm really proud that the book was able to kind of carry him through it.
Good stuff. Good stuff. I was going to ask you, obviously, when you write a book about anything historical, especially anything that has, a lot of elements that exist in the shadows and aren't written down and documented and so on. How did you go about researching it? There was actually some funny stories I heard on another podcast about you trying to get like files that pertain to it and everything.
Oh yeah, I mean it's a nightmare, and you're there's something very different too about coming to it as an American. You kind of have to be very aware, like coming as an American to this conflict, you have to be very respectful. You have to understand, what you're dealing with or whatever. But I'm also coming to it as an American journalist who's used to like FOIA and who's used to certain transparencies. Ironically, far be it for me to call America a transparent government, but like there's a certain level of like disclosures that you can get in the States that there was just no interest in talking about in the North. And there were some funny moments where, I came armed with like these thousands of pages from American court documents that detailed serial numbers and names and all these specifics. And I kind of took them to the PSNI and was basically laughed out of the room of like, we don't do any of that here, and you will not be getting any of this. And no, we don't have a courtroom where you can walk in and pull up old court cases from 1975. That was such a learning curve for me. Like you don't know these things. So, as with so much of the reporting and storytelling over here, like so much of it had to come from a ground level, and like meeting people in their neighborhoods and, getting to know, like someone in Philly knew someone in Tyrone who knew someone here, who knew someone there. And it's like, you have to go through these ladders of vetting for people to make sure that you're all right, and it's okay to talk to you. And that was really tough, and it took a really long time. And there's also there's an element of like you have to know when to walk away. Like there's certain things that people are just never going to talk about here, and it does not matter how many times you ask, how many different ways you ask. And so kind of knowing when to let a story lie, I think, is a trick too with this stuff. But yeah, the direct American reporter in me had to learn how to speak sideways.
Okay, yeah, we're almost at the end now. Anyone who's interested in the way that this conflict impacted America and the Irish diaspora, really interesting. The book is written like a thriller, but obviously there's no fiction in it. Was there anything you wanted to mention about the book, or just say to the audience before we go?
Yeah, I mean, I hope you read it. But I just, I was really, we got a lot of great reviews of the book. I was really proud that a lot of people said it was well researched, was well reported. But I do want to say, like, the most important responses to me were from the people who actually lived the story. And it is such a, they're very, they're, we're losing these stories, is what I'm trying to say. Like, a lot of the people who remember this time are gone or are going to be soon. I lost two people through the course of reporting it. And though those are just stories we won't get back and memories we won't get back. And I know there's an instinct in a lot of these circles in Irish America to not talk about it or not talk about it plainly. And I just think it's such an important story, and it's so important that we know this about our own history, and kind of record this, because it's going to be gone so soon, and it's such an important slice of this. And I hope that this can kind of start that conversation a little bit more.
Believe me, as a podcaster who wants to interview literally anyone who was involved and is willing to talk, I'd love to interview them. God above, on the off chance that anyone who'd be interested in talking, maybe from the Irish American side, even if you weren't directly involved, you just kind of knew people, and you're able to talk about it, it would be a great way to not in print, but put into like the historical record, all these stories that will die with them if they're not recorded. So yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, completely, completely.
Very good. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I hope. Oh, actually, sorry, I didn't mean to ask you. Do you plan on exploring the topic of the Troubles again in any books?
I think I'm going to take a break for a little bit. It's a tough ground to kind of to trod. But I'm based in Belfast these days. I still write about the North, and I don't. You never know if a good story pops up. I'm still here. So if anyone out there has one, find me.
Thank you very much, Ali Watkins. The name of the book is This Next One's for You. I highly recommend it. Any producers from Hollywood, film companies, or Netflix, HBO, any of them, if you're listening, please make it into a series. It would be fantastic.
Thanks for having me, John. This is great.
Thank you very much.